the Russia-Ukraine war. Before we start, I'd like to declare my bias. I lived in the Baltics for 3 years, and during that time, I developed a warm relationship with a very cold region. I nonetheless have a deep appreciation for the Baltics and the role that they play as key member states defending our northeastern flank. While some NATO member states remain reluctant to push back against the Russian regime's imperialist actions in Ukraine, the Baltic states early on demonstrated spectacular leadership by providing significant diplomatic, military, and humanitarian support to Ukraine. As frequently stated by Estonia's Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, the only path to peace is that Ukraine must win this war and Russia must retreat to its borders. Baltic actions are arguably based on a widespread belief that the fate of Ukraine is directly tied to that of the Baltics and NATO. Unsurprisingly, over the weekend, while NATO allies and partners are meeting in Ramstein to consider pros and cons about delivering military aid to Ukraine, the Baltic states jointly made a declaration supporting the immediate delivery of Leopard tanks to Ukraine in order to help to stop Russian aggression. To discuss these issues, I'd like to welcome 3 very distinguished guests. Firstly, I'd like to welcome President Toomas Hendrik Ilves, distinguished non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and former president of Estonia. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Dr. Artis Pabriks. He is the former Deputy Prime Minister of Latvia. He was also Minister of Defense on 2 occasions and Minister of Foreign Affairs. And he is currently the director and founder of a new think tank, the Northern European Policy Center. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Mr. Jonas Survila, currently the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania. Previously, he served as the political advisor to the Prime Minister of Lithuania, Ingrida Šimonytė. Welcome to all 3 of our guests. I'd like to start with President Ilves, if you could unmute for us, please. Now, last week, the Estonian government announced its biggest military aid package to Ukraine to date. Can you explain to us why Estonia has consistently been one of the top supporters of Ukraine in this war? Thank you.
Well, I think it goes back long before Ukraine, actually, to be honest. This applies to the Baltic states and to Poland. If you recall that in August of 2008, with the rather mediocre, if not piddling, response of the West to the invasion of Georgia, the leaders of the 3 Baltic countries and Poland flew down to show our support to Georgia in the middle of the war when Russian troops were 40 kilometers from Tbilisi. For us, of course, I think for me, at least when I look at it, I mean, what it really comes down to is the post World War II settlement that you do not change borders through aggression. And that principle is it's a generally accepted principle, but if you're a country with a history such as ours, this is of vital importance, which is why we, or at least Estonia, but I assume this is true of our neighbors as well, given their response, is that we must, this is one thing we cannot back off from, and we must defend and ensure the post-war settlement above all else, because who is going to be the next victim if we allow aggression to stand, if an invasion can change borders? And this is, I think, at least the principle by which I have always stood by. And so if you get to zero in on your particular question on why we put so much into this, well, that is ultimately the reason why. And if you want to, you can turn around and say, well, every Russian tank blown up with Estonian weapons in Ukraine is, in the case of an invasion, is one less Russian tank that would be blown up on Estonian territory. But that, I mean, but really to be serious about it, it is really the fact that we must stand by this. And this is I think this is for me at least, explains why we find talk about, well, we must have peace negotiations. I mean, any acceptance of the change of borders via aggression is completely unacceptable and opens a can of worms that we cannot accept, and that has direct and dire consequences for us, which may not be felt in Berlin now that Berlin has new buffer states, which it did not have before. I think that in 1988, I think Bonn would have been just as concerned about changing borders through aggression as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland are today. So we, Pace, Emmanuel Macron, are not warmongers. We are, in fact, people who stand by the 1945 UN Charter, which, in fact, forbids aggression. I mean, that was the fundamental principle of why the UN came together. So changing borders through military means and use of force is something that is of existential importance to countries like mine. And once you understand that as the fundamental principle by which we operate, then most of what we do and say should make complete sense. It is simply the one axiom by which we operate.
Thank you, President Ilves. I think that's a great start to the discussion, and especially this issue of how this represents an existential threat, not only to the Baltics, but beyond. Let's turn now to Dr. Pabriks. Man ļoti prieks, ka jūs esat šeit. Since the February 2022 escalation, you have argued that if other transatlantic allies gave as much support to Ukraine as the Baltics, quote unquote, the war would be over. Can you elaborate on your reasoning behind that? Thank you. Or please unmute also.
Sorry, yes. First of all, it's nice to hear and see all of you there, and I can definitely subscribe what President Ilves already told before, because Latvian and Estonian and Lithuanian and Polish policies, and in fact, in many ways also policies of such country as Finland, is very close vis-a-vis Ukraine. Now, if I have to elaborate on the preaching since already the beginning of February of the last year, where I have been, and many other people actually, I would say, also have been telling that we must give assistance to Ukraine as much as is needed, because if you distance yourself a little bit from this situation of providing weaponry and assistance, what do we see? First of all, we do see that since the beginning of the war, the equipment deliveries have been increasing in numbers and also have been increasing in quality. We do not speak anymore about offensive weapons and defensive weapons, which have been a discourse in Germany, for instance, for months or so after the starting of the war. We do not discuss many other things, simply they are coming in place. But the problem is that this military assistance to Ukraine to defend its legitimate interest, its freedom, its territory, its borders, has been, we can compare with something like cutting a cat's tail piece by piece, and if we as the West, if we really preach that our systems, political systems, our societies are built on values which we inscribe in our constitutions and in UN Charter and etc., how could it be that we are actually standing and watching and spending time on, I would call it sometimes fruitless discussions, while Ukrainians are dying, simply civilians are dying, not only soldiers, from Russian shelling. And if we are looking to this balance of economic might, if one can say, Russia is globally, what, about maybe 2.5%, something like this, maybe a bit more. So basically, economic size of Russia is quite similar to that of Canada. And on the Western side, if we look to all those countries, 50 plus, which are actually preaching that they will and they should assist Ukraine and at least standing officially on the Ukrainian side, that is about 50% of global economy. So how could it be that the war is waged for a year already and it goes so kind of step by step? And I would say that we simply have to step up this support now to give as much as we can, as much as our industries can deliver, as much as our militaries can deliver. And this is what Baltic countries have been doing. Because if we look to Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian deliveries, then nobody can surpass us if you looked at this in a proportional way. So this is a way how to deal and teach authoritarian, totalitarian leaders like Putin. There is no other way.
Thank you, Dr. Pabriks. And I want to remind our audience also that the three Baltic states, together with Poland, are the top 4 contributors as percentage of GDP to assistance for Ukraine. And as Dr. Pabriks highlighted also, his main point being that if NATO countries stand together, then this war would be over. If they spent like the Baltics, one could argue. I remember being at one of the Riga conferences about 4 or 5 years ago, where someone made the point and said that the combined military budget of the Baltics and the Nordic states is actually larger than that of Russia, just those states alone. So just to put things into perspective, let's turn to Vice Minister.
That was then.
That was then. Yes, things are different. But the GDP of NATO member states combined is still significantly larger than Russia's, of course. So let's turn to Vice Minister Survila. Lithuania has often gone further than other countries in pushing for more extensive sanctions against Russia's banking sector, IT sector, fertilizers, crypto assets, and so on. From a Lithuanian perspective, where are the current loopholes? What more can be done to make this war more economically expensive for Russia? And what are the key challenges in terms of implementing sanctions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very important topic. And just to continue what my previous colleagues told, we still, as a Euro-Atlantic community and political family, still has a lot of unused potential how we could help Ukraine. Geopolitical, economical, technological, on various fields. The same applies to economy and sanctions as an economic tool. So now we are preparing as the EU the 10th, and we'll be discussing 10th EU sanctions package. There are still a lot of important big items that can be put on board. And of course, we could have been much faster. It's a tragedy, I think, that we need such events as Bucha's, Irpin, now Dnipros, to generate political will. This kind of salami tactic is producing very important results in terms of inflicting economic pain and loss on Russia, but it's still slow. We would prefer to move much faster. Speaking more specifically and concretely, so it's uranium, Rosatom. We can also ban transit of sanctioned goods to third countries that goes via Russian Belarus, ICT sector, lasers, dual use. There are still Russian banks that are not included in this thing. So there are plenty of items. Lithuania suggested the package for the discussion on 10th one. that is worth 1.6 billion euros. A lot of individuals to be included. So there is still a lot of, a lot of items and a lot of still space to go. Besides that, it's very important to also put sanctions on Belarus. We should not forget the second partner in crime, Russian partner in crime, partner in so-called Krugovaya Porucha, as Kremlin insiders, are thinking. So we should mirror and put much bigger pressure on Belarus, mirror Russian sanctions, because then Belarus is becoming a way to circumvent Russian sanctions. So we should close those loopholes. Also, we should stricter check and strive for standard of implementation of sanctions, because as you know, when you agreed, then it's up to member states to look, to supervise how they are implemented. So there is still a lot of good practices from United States, from OFAC, to build up this knowledge. It's great that you in the middle of a month appointed new sanctions special envoy. So it would help to coordinate the sanctions policy and its implementation, but there are still a lot of things to do, both in expansion of it and also in implementation.
Thank you, Vice Minister. And I had to laugh a little bit when I read an article in the Financial Times calling Lithuania "quote unquote" hawkish on these sanctions issues. But I think you make great points on deepening. There's a lot more scope to deepen these sanctions against Russia, but also to target some Russian partners like Belarus.
We are not hawkish. We are not hawkish. We are empathic to Ukrainian suffering. Ukrainians each day are paying with their blood. We are paying only with our euros. So this is a tremendous difference, and we should not forget it.
Thank you. All right, let's turn back again to President Ilves. Please tell us about Estonia's history of Russian cyber attacks and how those experiences are shaping Estonia's response now to current cyber threats at home and in Ukraine. Thank you.
Well, we experienced what I guess now already in history books is considered the first case of cyber war in April, May of 2007, after we moved the infamous bronze soldier from the center of Tallinn to a military cemetery, which was a more appropriate place for it. We experienced massive DDoS attacks. DDoS stands for Distributed Denial of Service, which means basically, just so people would understand, no one ever got into any of the systems, but what a DDoS attack does, as the Distributed Denial of Service says, basically you overload servers so they cannot respond. And so banks, newspapers, all kinds of public services were overloaded by these attacks, to the point where we actually had to cut ourselves off from the rest of the world so that we wouldn't get attacks from outside, and then we at least could function internally. Why I say it's the first cyber war is that at least I claim that taking the Clausewitzian definition of war as the continuation by other means, the continuation of policy by other means. It was the continuation of an anti-Estonian policy, international and different state, publicly via other means. They did not penetrate anything really. At that time, we were already one of the most advanced countries in Europe digitally. Since then, we have devoted a huge amount of funds and effort to cybersecurity. Even before the cyber attacks, as NATO members, we had been asking for or suggesting that NATO have a center of excellence for cyber defense. NATO has had at the time 81 centers of excellence, including things such as a center of excellence for operations in closed and shallow waters based in Kiel, but there was nothing for cyber. And we kept being brushed off by NATO saying, no, we don't need that. Cyber is not a thing. And so, well, after that, in fact, they finally relented and decided that maybe Tallinn would be a good place to have a NATO center for cyber defense. And since then, we have been, we have the center. We also have, as a result, the EU Schengen Security Center here for digital control of who enters the EU. We have been working closely with Ukraine for years and years. When they had their first massive cyber attack in January, February of 2015, two teams went out, one from Estonia, the other one from the NSA, to go and see what was going on. Well, it is one of our areas of expertise within NATO, is that we have devoted a lot of attention to cybersecurity. And here I should say that when both, in the case of, there is this myth of, there's articles, well, cyber, the dog that didn't bark in the Ukraine war. It's utter nonsense. It's barking nonstop. What is important to keep in mind is that the amelioration methods are so strong right now. Ukraine is constantly under cyber attack right now. As we speak, it is relentless. We are under constant cyber attack. Soon as the Finnish parliament passed its vote saying it wanted to join NATO, boom, suddenly Finland came under massive cyber attack. Countries have taken dramatic steps since 2007 to boost their cyber resilience and have done rather well. And so that's kind of the state of play when it comes to cyber issues. This is, those attacks that I just mentioned are both not only DDoS attacks to shut servers down, but also various forms of penetration. And it's a constant problem that we have to deal with now, and Russia is rather good at it, and it's cheap. It doesn't cost much, so it's a cheap form of attack. And we have I would say all of NATO has been experiencing this for almost 20 years.
Thank you, President Ilves, and I think it's a good analogy about the dog barking constantly, because I think in the beginning of this or since the February escalation, everyone's been asking what's happening on the cyber front. But I think there's been a lot of development across the Baltics, also with Ukraine as a partner on the cyber issues, through not only also through Lithuania in particular. The regional cyber center. I know I don't know the involvement of the center of excellence that you mentioned, specifically with Ukraine, but a lot has been done, as you mentioned. I
would add that actually the Baltic countries and Finland are actually much more advanced when it comes to cyber defense than much of Western Europe is. UK is superb, France isn't bad, but a lot of the other countries, and the Netherlands are really, really good. But a lot of other countries are actually pretty mediocre, frankly. And again, it's yet one other area where perhaps our military might, when it comes to conventional or kinetic warfare, is not as great as other countries. But when it comes to cyber, the Baltic countries actually are far better than sort of old Europe, to use Rumsfeld's term.
Thank you, President Ilves. Let's turn again to Dr. Pabriks, and please feel free also to comment on the cyber issue, given how recent you were in your position as Deputy Prime Minister as well as Minister of Defense. If I remember correctly, I think Latvia experienced one of the biggest cyber attacks against it about a month or so shortly before the February escalation last year. So feel free to comment about that. But I have another question to you also. What is your assessment of the current battlefield dynamics in Ukraine, and what are you expecting in the next few months? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that second is kind of a difficult question, of course, but I will start with the first, and I would like to remind to all those who listen to us that as far as excellence centers, all three Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, we have been actually litmus test for different type of Russian attacks, either cyber attacks or use of fake news and strategic communication against us, or energy tools. And this is why, if you are looking to the Baltic states, then you can see that we do have here three types of excellence centers. Cyber goes basically with Estonians. Lithuanians have Energy Excellence Center, and we do have a NATO Excellence Center for Strategic Communication. So we have been pointing, in fact, towards these challenges already way before the war started. Now, as far as current situation on the front line, I think that situation is quite difficult, and not without the reason. Ukrainians are actually asking for larger military assistance, and if it would be me who had to decide, I would definitely break this this cord and discussion as far as deliveries of heavy tanks like Leopards or Abrams or others, and of course European type of tanks would be better at this stage because simply of the maintenance. But I also would go immediately also for the deliveries of planes, all types of planes, what Ukrainians, let's say, can digest and can use. And I think that would be F-16s. I would, if F-16s would go there, we could speak also about Gripen from Sweden. We also could use this splendid battlefield anti-tank planes like A-10s, which is still from the Cold War, but could be useful if you have different type of air defense systems. And as far as air defense systems, we know that now Patriot systems are moving from Germany to Eastern Poland. And in fact, it seems to me that they will be placed so close to Ukrainian western borders that if they would have political will or the possibilities, they could also defend the sky over such cities as Lviv. And that would be highly important, because I already hear that somebody is telling, yes, but that might escalate or something like this. How could this escalate if a Russian missile is flying towards city Lviv, and doesn't matter who, but if it is cut down, I think it's fine, because especially this is also the region where our Western assistance is going to Ukrainians. So as far as the battlefield, I would say that if we do provide Ukrainians with all the needed equipment, then they can change in the following months the patterns, and they simply can push Russians back, despite of this massive manpower what Russia is actually wasting on the battlefield, because obviously 200,000 lives of their conscripts, soldiers, criminals, and etc. doesn't count for Moscow, it doesn't count for Kremlin. So if Ukraine wants to stand against such masses of people which are pushed against them from the Russian side, they definitely need much more equipment. And this is why, for instance, postponement and discussion about around the Leopards, I think this is so irritating for all of us who are willing to finish this war as soon as possible and start to recover Ukraine.
Just very briefly, while you're talking about weapons also, where do you stand on ATACMS, providing Ukraine with ATACMS?
Well, again, I think we should give Ukrainians all what they need, and I don't see a reason why should we give missiles which are reaching 80 kilometers or 100 and not more, because it's simply there is no point to discuss such things, because for instance, when we had this discussion about offensive and defensive weapons and that Ukrainians cannot shoot across the border, what would we do if Ukrainian soldier is reaching the Ukrainian-Russian border and he can shoot across the border with pistol? Would we take a pistol away? Of course not. There are no such type of as offensive or defensive weapons. Any weapon which is used for defense of freedom, of territory of Ukraine is defensive weapon. It's so simple. So I think we are sometimes simply dragged into the wrong direction, and we can see also here how Russians nicely use all their assets which they have been put in the Western societies, different types of NGOs, individuals, media, journalists, which are keeping up these discussions that, oh, would that not be escalation if we would give more assistance to Ukraine? The only thing what is escalation is that we are giving up to the totalitarian will, and Russian appetite, Putin's appetite, is simply fed by our indecisiveness and delays. We have been escalating, in fact, when we were not giving enough of support in 2008 to Georgia. We have been escalating when we were not enough hard once Russia annexed Crimea. So now we are with our backs to the wall, and finally we have to act correctly.
Thank you. All right, let's move away a little bit from the military discussion again, and talk about something else that's really pivotal to this discussion on Russia-Ukraine. Vice Minister Survila, there's a strong link, of course, between energy security, economic well-being, and the ability, of course, of the Baltics to support Ukraine, especially in light of the fact that Putin has used energy to bully some of its neighbors and beyond. Now, Lithuania took a somewhat different route from the other two Baltic states when it comes to energy diversification, especially when we talk about LNG, in the sense that you took some early steps in that direction. Can you tell us about that and how it's impacted Lithuania on these issues? Thank you.
Thank you. You very well described about Putin weaponizing energy, but this is nothing new in Baltics. Because when Baltic states were restoring their independence and were fighting for their independence in the 90s, Soviet Union responded not only with military interventions, but also with energy blockade, stopping oil and gas supplies. So he had this, living memory. And I remember more than 10 years ago, when we started and pursued the building of LNG terminal in Klaipėda, some politicians in Western Europe and in big industrial countries were telling us, look, this LNG gas will be much more expensive. It would not be economically viable. Why are you doing this? Business of business is business, and energy is part of the business. So back then we were saying, though, that this is a short-sighted strategy to be over-dependent. We were consistently opposing Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 because we back then saw the geopolitical implications for that. And generally, we wanted to diversify earlier. So in 2014, we built LNG terminal. Also, Baltic states built various links, both gas and electricity links with Sweden, Poland, Estonia, with Finland, strengthened their interpipe infrastructure and created common Baltic market in energy. So we were, consistently diversifying before it was cool. Therefore, for us, it didn't come up as a surprise. And when Russian aggression against Ukraine and war against Ukraine started, we decided to fully stop import from Russia. So zero oil, zero gas, zero electricity. From May last year, we stopped all energy imports, and despite that, we had 2% GDP growth. So it's a sign that the economy might be resilient. You can be energy safe, but you need to prepare, have links between other countries, and that's it. So this is a thing that we should, now, put forward and fast track on the EU level. I know that various countries are implementing. Germans are finally going and moving rapidly in a good direction. So we should, speed up this process and learn from the best examples.
Thank you, Vice Minister. Those are great points. And while we're talking about energy, let's turn to President Ilves also. Of course, in Estonia, you've had a lot of great success over the last few months. The LNG terminal at Baltic was built in a record time of 6 months. As one method to diversify Estonia's energy supplies away from the Russian gas market. How has this been possible, and what lessons can you share with other countries looking to diversify their energy supplies? And then let me throw in a question from one of our audience members, also from Jenny, who's asking about cyber defense. She's asking, cyber defense has been discussed, but is there any concept of cyber offense that could be mounted by cyber experts across Ukraine's allies, including the Baltics? And could we beat the Russians at their own game? Thank you.
Okay, well, I mean, the Baltic terminal is not that great a success, since basically the Finns kind of kidnapped it for themselves, meaning that they built one and we have one, and they ended up being theirs ended up being the main one. So I'm not sure how big a success, except it does show that where there is a will, you can in fact quickly construct an LNG terminal, and it's there, and should push come to shove, I mean, or, sort of when we need gas, it's there. Cyber defense, I mean, basically, forget cyber. It's this whole discussion, this is an offensive weapon, not a defensive weapon. No, a weapon is a weapon. Now, if you're doing it to defend your country, it's a defensive weapon. If you use the same weapon to invade a country, it's an offensive weapon. And this is true whether it is a Colt pistol or it is the latest form of a cyber weapon. Anything you use to defend your networks can be used reversed to attack another network. And that's just the nature of weapons. And so, yes, I mean, for a while, there was this discussion of active defense, which is a bizarre, I mean, when it came to cyber, sort of active cyber defense, which is kind of a bizarre way of saying that we'll do something to them if they do something to us, or we'll disable something of theirs if they do something to us. But, they're really, I mean, offensive versus defensive has to do with who's invading whom. It does not have any, their weapons don't, I mean, the concept, the defense or offense does not inhere in weapons. I mean, you might say maybe in the case of mines, yeah, maybe you could say that mines are sort of defensive, but if you start chucking mines at someone, then they're offensive, right? So we have to, I mean, this is why this entire discussion that we see in West European capitals drives me nuts, because it's like, what do you mean that sort of a small tank is defensive, a main battle tank is offensive, And especially when you're talking about where the theater of war is an invaded country. How are you using an offensive weapon when you're on your own territory fighting people who have invaded you? The metaphysics of this is mind-boggling. And I mean, it's, I would say, Hegelian.
Do you see, however, NATO stepping in? I think that's the core of the question, perhaps. But do you see NATO stepping in to provide more cyber support for Ukraine against Russia in a more active manner?
NATO is actually not that great when it comes to cyber. Individual members are far better. So I don't see what NATO would do. I think that I think bilaterally, the individual experiences of more advanced cyber countries is of much greater use than NATO itself, except perhaps for the kind of early warning. I mean, NATO does have a coordinating role in this. I mean, this really comes more down to the problems of NATO and cyber, which is that countries are not that willing to share that much even within NATO in the way that I think they should. So NATO is not all powerful when it comes to cyber issues. But I do know that in terms of individual nations' support for Ukraine, there is quite a bit, and my own country has been working closely both in Kyiv and also in Tallinn itself with Ukrainians who are actually brilliant when it comes to all matters digital.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's turn to Dr. Pabriks again. Although some transatlanticists discussed this pre-February 2022 escalation, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine drove home the point that NATO's long-term strategy, especially in the Baltics, should be changed from deterrence by punishment to deterrence by denial. Could you comment about that?
Yes, because our philosophy in Riga, and I believe also in our neighboring countries, was very simple. Before Russian invasion in Ukraine, basically our allies have been thinking in a direction like, if there is some kind of attack on Baltic countries, we probably cannot defend them immediately, so Russia will conquer some territories, and then we will come back and assist them to free that territory in a while. Seeing what is happening in Ukraine, how Russia is waging war, what happens in Bucha, with all these things, obviously we cannot remain silent, and we requested also from our allies that Latvian or Estonian citizens should have just the same security like other NATO ally citizens, either they are in Germany, France, Britain, or Spain, or name the country. And that would mean that we cannot afford such a situation where some parts of our territory, even for a while, could be conquered by the Russian forces. That, of course, requires totally different military thinking, political thinking, and also stationing of different numbers and different types of troops also on the Baltic territories. And this is why we have been quite vocal also in the Madrid summit, where we reached, in fact, also a quite successful aim to have in each of our countries more or less a brigade to be stationed. From Latvian case, I can more speak about Latvians. We got also a signed document between us and Canadians, and I would say it was not at the beginning so easy because simply countries were still not used to such type of requests and demands. But we managed to do this. We are also not just security users or takers, because we agreed in this document which we signed between our president and Mr. Trudeau. I was also nearby as a defense minister. We were both there, Canadian and Latvian, that we will establish a new military exercise field in Latvia within the next 2 years. It will happen. And I hope that Canadians plus other nations with this brigade will be able to train there, to be there. But the major goal, of course, is also to get additional technological capabilities, air defense systems, more also combat tanks. The stuff, in fact, which maybe at this moment our armies are missing for a number of reasons, because it's not only our budgetary restraints, because of course we are small countries and we cannot buy so easily a Patriot system, because one Patriot system costs about one.
I think we lost Dr. Pabriks there momentarily, but we'll hopefully he can get back to us. Let's turn to Vice Minister Survila in the meantime. I hope you can hear me. Okay, so let's pivot the discussion a little bit to other related issues. So like the other two Baltic states, Lithuania is now home to a variety of political dissidents from Russia and Belarus. How do you view your role, or sorry, how do you view their role in relation to the Russia-Ukraine war and the situation in Belarus? And what type of support are you providing to those individuals? Thank you.
Thank you. This is our historical tradition to support the dissidents from actually Middle Ages, those who were running from Moscow and they were running to Kiev or Vilnius. So this is in line, I think, with our also moral, political, legal duties to accept political dissidents. So yes, you're right. In Vilnius now we have very vibrant communities of Russian and Belarusian dissidents, political activists, artists, journalists. Various teams are working and creating them. So in some cases, for the leader, for example, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the true legitimate leader and only legitimate leader of current Belarus, is having a shelter and having a base currently in Vilnius. So we provide her with protection, because it's a risk to her life, to be independent, free to voice independent opinions. So we are just giving them space, and then it's up for them to create political programs, to create ideas, to provide the alternative and truthful sources of information for their people who are across the border, either in Russia or in Belarus. So I think this is important to create alternative vision, to create alternative program, and to be ready to fight and implement these ideas when they will have a chance. So now it's our duty just to provide the oxygen, the ecosystem where they could, independently, freely create their own initiatives and be ready for democratic change someday.
Thank you, Vice Minister, and thank you also for your role in supporting those individuals and those groups. Of course, Lithuania plays an extremely important role in that regard. Let's move again to President Ilves. Of course, there's a strong link between this conflict, Russia's use of energy to manipulate prices around the world, and of course, inflation. And for several months in 2022, Estonia's inflation averaged nearly 20%, which I believe is one of the highest rates in Europe. Now, although Estonia's inflation is reportedly slowing, how do you see the continuing cost of the living crisis impacting domestic support for Ukraine in Estonia and perhaps in the Baltics also, if you care to comment about that?
Well, the high inflation in this country was due to stupid policies by an earlier government, which flooded the money supply. And the populists that did that are now the ones arguing that because of inflation, we shouldn't support Ukraine. So it's kind of, it's not very good, I would say. I mean, we have elections on the 5th of March. The hard right populists are very popular. And frankly, we'll see what happens. But in any case, generally popular support for Ukraine is very high, extremely high, at least among Estonians. I mean, I would say that among Estonians in this country, it is almost universal. But I mean, the government, I mean, the populist parties are trying to sort of basically separate Ukraine from the issue of domestic policy and focus on really issues and problems that they themselves caused. So, I mean, I don't want to get too much into domestic problems, but this is a serious issue here. The inflation was much higher in Estonia precisely because of stupid mistakes, or not mistakes, they were stupid policies followed by earlier governments. And here we are. I mean, though inflation has come down to 9%, which is much more manageable than the plus 20% we were running in parts of last year.
Thank you. Let's while we're talking about the ability to perhaps support Ukraine because of domestic factors, also let's turn to Dr. Pabriks to talk to us a little bit about military supplies. How has Baltic support for Ukraine impacted on your own military supplies and your ability to defend yourselves? And what type of Baltic cooperation did you promote since February last year to develop Baltic resilience? Thank you.
I will start maybe with the second part, because the Baltic resilience and Baltic cooperation in many ways didn't change much because of this invasion, because most of the plans how we can collaborate with each other in emergency of war or crisis, they have been already there. For instance, one of the things is that we would like to be able to cross border towards each other's countries with our troops, without parliaments taking certain decisions. So basically to make it smoother and quicker. That's one of the things. Secondly, of course, we have been in all three countries pushing up a request for larger defense spending, defense budgets. In Latvian case, we are going now for 3%. And in Latvian case also, we are at this moment already discussing in the parliament a legislation which would, additionally to professional service, put also conscript service and also civil service, which would not be only, and this is a discussion now, which would not be only alternative, as we could understand some people who maybe, which I totally cannot actually support, like pacifism, because for each pacifist there is somebody who is risking his or her life. But it's not only for people who alternatively would like to serve if they cannot go to military, but in general to create a civil service which would provide additional resources to hospitals, to medical services, to border guards, to interior ministry. So this type of discussion. Plus, in Latvian case, we work already for some 4 or 5 years on so-called comprehensive defense system, which in understandable definitions would be called simply total defense, which means that each and every company, municipality, and individual should know how they should act in emergency moments, in crisis, or even during the war times. And I think one of the challenges what we see now actually is the military industry. And we see that Latvian military industry in the last years have been stepping up quite a bit as far as, for instance, drone production, because we are one of the, I would say, most reliable drone producers and providers for Ukrainians. They are not a combat drones like Bayraktar, but reconnaissance drones at this moment. But we know that Ukrainians value them very highly, and a number of other NATO countries, actually including UK, are looking to purchase some stuff from Latvia in this case. But we also see shortages, because all the NATO planning of old Western countries and the new Western countries have been not correct as far as logistics, as far as production of ammunition, for instance, because we can see in what amounts ammunition is discharged during this war in Ukraine. And simply our industries in the West were following this probably at this moment already a bit naive idea, like liberal democracies won and wars never will come. No, they come. And military industry actually in the West is not in place. We need to step up quite a bit with this, and here, of course, for such countries as Latvia, we have a great chance, because first of all, we need to produce something ourselves, because we cannot rely simply on for instance, that somebody will give us leopards, because they might not, and secondly, we simply, each of us needs to work on this in order to simply supply our stocks, because stocks are getting empty also in NATO countries because of this war.
Thank you for those reminders, of course, also that there is always a price to pay with any form of support. Let's turn to Vice Minister Survila, and I know we're starting to run out of time, so maybe I'll combine two questions to you also. Now, about a month ago, Putin said that Russia is ready to negotiate over Ukraine. Now Lavrov is saying that the West has ruined it. What's your position on negotiating with Putin about this Russia-Ukraine war? And there's also a question from one of our audience members about the role that the Baltics are playing or expect the UN to play in defending Ukraine or resolving this war. Perhaps you could also maybe say something about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think Putin should be prosecuted and not negotiated with. The only thing he can negotiate is his prison term in the international tribunal for his crimes, international crimes, crimes of aggression, brutal ones, genocide-like acts against Ukrainian civilians. You know, Putin and the system he created showed that they do not acknowledge any kind of borders and limits, legal one, geographical one, political one, even human ones, when they employ brutal torturing machine against civilians, creating filtration camps for Ukrainians, torturing children, etc. So you cannot negotiate with brutal criminals, and the same applies to Alexander Lukashenko. So that could be our short answer, and wider regarding the Baltics. So I think we see our role, or at least we in Lithuania, as those who has to defend values, international norms and rules, don't go into compromise with devil, and be consistent. And it's not only just a kind of moral stance. We have experience on and expertise of Russia. Our intelligence community is very strong. We know the modus operandi. So it's not only about threat assessment, but I think it's also about policy prescription for a future, which policy works and which do not. So current status, in current circumstances, that there should be full containment on various spheres, from battlefield and the Ukrainian victory. So we should aim not for any kind of talks with war criminal, but should do anything we can to help Ukrainians win. So that's probably our mission, to provide policy proposals that works better, and to defend the values and international norms.
Thank you, Vice Minister. I'll give 30 seconds to each of our panelists just to say some concluding remarks, and feel free if you wanted to add on to anything that any of the other panelists said earlier. President Ilves, let's start with you.
Well, I would say that, I mean, we shouldn't really single out the Baltic countries. I think we have a broad consensus in the central and eastern part of Europe regarding Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, and disregarding one presidential candidate's statements about Article 5 this past weekend in the Czech Republic. I mean, I think the Eastern Europe, with the exception of Hungary, is very much in line with the kind of thinking that you have heard from us here. So I don't see that many differences. And also, we also have the Nordic countries of Finland and Sweden coming into NATO. Well, I mean, at least making the political effort to do so. I would say that in terms of our security situation, with the eventual admission of Finland and Sweden into NATO, the entire security environment in this area changes so completely, from discussions of defense depth regarding the Baltic countries and sort of how, because we're just a thin sliver of land compared to the huge Eurasian landmass of Russia. But suddenly when the Baltic Sea turns into a lake, NATO lake, and an F-35 can basically cross between Estonia and Finland 8 times in an hour, back and forth, 8 round trips. It's a very different situation from what it has been up till now. And so I think that this region, taken as a whole, not just the 3 Baltic countries, which has been, I think, is the wrong focus, will come to play a much larger role in discussions of the security situation in Europe as a whole.
Thank you. Those are great points. Let's turn to Dr. Pabriks. Final remarks.
Yes, I would like to continue on what President Ilves told. I really believe that this war is showing who is who stands by values and who only pay lip service for values, and etc. And from that perspective, I think that at the end of this war, so-called Northern European region around the Baltic Sea, which is Baltic countries, Nordic countries, Poland, and Ukraine, in continental Europe will be with much more influence than before, because we have been showing what we can, how we do this, and I think we have been an example for many others. And I think together with United Kingdom and transatlantic partners, US and Canada, that would be quite a good force. But at this moment, to reach this goal, I think I will just repeat the mantra: give as much as possible in as soon as possible timing. And this is what Western societies must understand and do.
Thank you, Dr. Pabriks. Vice Minister, let's turn to you for concluding remarks.
Yeah, so in order to contain Putin's Russia and its imperialism, we should first stop self-containment, because as we previously touched, we are still not using our as Euro-Atlantic family potential, economic, political, diplomatic, military, in helping Ukraine and also in reinforcing our deterrence. So this could lead to, if we increase it and step up, it would lead to Ukrainian victory. After Ukrainian victory, there is a chance for a possibility for a democratic change in Russia. So, but we should, start in a good order. the process.
Of course, thank you. Thank you, Vice Minister. And I would like to thank all three of our very distinguished panelists, President Ilves, Dr. Pabriks, and Vice Minister Survila, for your insightful contributions to this Russia-Ukraine dialogue. I, of course, respect what President Ilves said during his concluding remarks, but I have to emphasize that over the past year, the Baltics in particular have made me extremely proud. Thank you also for our audience for tuning in. And our next Russia-Ukraine dialogue will focus on Belarus in the context of the ongoing war. Thank you again to all our panelists and our audience, and goodbye.